It was a beautiful day on the island of Sodor. Thomas and Percy were busy shunting trucks at Brendam Docks. But they were being a little silly. But Thomas and Percy weren't really being very careful. King of the Railway. Long ago, before there were any railways, the island of Sodor was ruled by kings, and the greatest king of Sodor was King Godred. Godred was a well-loved king. He protected the island from invaders with the help of his gallant knights in armor. Life was good under Godred's reign. It was a golden age, and King Godred wore a golden crown. But one day, the crown was stolen. The thieves were eventually caught, but the crown had been hidden. It was never seen again. The ruins of King Godred's castle can still be found at Ulfstead on the Earl of Sodor's estate. These days, instead of knights in shining armor, it's railway engines who charge about the island, or across to the mainland via the rolling bridge at Vickerstown that can be raised up like a castle drawbridge to let ships pass. One day, Thomas had been sent to the washdown with Annie and Clarabelle. But Thomas and his coaches weren't the only ones there. Thomas and his friends were very excited. They had never met the Earl before. All the engines and all the guests were waiting for Spencer to arrive with the Earl. The next morning, the Fat Controller sent Thomas to Brendam Docks to collect a shipment for the Earl. Thomas climbed slowly up the steep slope to the Earl's estate. Thomas was left wondering about the Earl's plan and the King's golden crown. One evening, at the Vickerstown rolling bridge, a certain silver streamlined engine came back to the island. The next morning, Percy brought Gordon his coaches. Gordon hurried after Spencer, but it was hard to build up speed with 4 heavy coaches behind him. He was just catching up when Spencer pulled off the main line towards the Earl's estate. Later that morning, Percy was shunting trucks at Brendam Docks when he noticed an engine hiding behind some crates. In the afternoon, Thomas met Spencer up at the Blue Mountain Quarry. As Thomas watched Spencer go, he couldn't help wondering what the Earl wanted with big blocks of stone. The other engines were curious too. Just then, Toby arrived with a very important message. Percy arrived at Brendam Docks. Poor Henry was stuck on a siding with his broken safety valve. Percy was very excited. He had never pulled a long, heavy goods train before. James stubbornly backed into position to pull the long train. So Thomas and Percy pulled in front of him. So Percy, Thomas, and James were all coupled to the trucks, and off they went to the Earl's estate. As the engines approached the Earl's estate, they saw new rails, and wooden sleepers, stone, and building materials. Then Thomas saw his old friend Jack the front loader. The heavy goods train was split up. James and Percy took the building materials, while Thomas shunted the crates and containers onto a new siding. At the steamworks, Victor was surprised to see Thomas, James, and Percy. That night, in Tidmouth's sheds, Thomas, Percy, and James told the other engines about Stephen. The next morning, Henry was still having trouble with his safety valve. Emily was very happy to take Henry to the steamworks. She wanted to see the old-fashioned engine. But when she arrived, she couldn't see any engines at all. Emily wasn't the only engine who wanted to see Stephen. Over the coming weeks, everyone at the steamworks worked hard to restore the old engine. Thomas and his friends came by whenever they could. They wanted to see how the work was progressing. Soon Stephen looked shiny and new. His funnel was straightened, his boiler had been fixed, and he had been given his old tender, a whistle, and a fresh coat of paint. Thomas and his friends were very excited, but Stephen looked a little sad. And then an idea flew into Thomas's funnel. James and Percy wondered if Thomas was doing the right thing. But Stephen just laughed. Percy, Thomas, and James climbed up the steep track to the estate. The castle looked very different now that it was being restored. Percy, Thomas, and James wondered what kind of special job the Earl had in mind for them. At the steamworks, Henry's valve had finally been fixed. He was ready to go back to his job. Stephen was eager to find out about his job too. But Stephen wasn't feeling patient. He was feeling excited. So, like a brave knight of old, Stephen set off on a quest to find his new job. Percy, Thomas, and James had already found their new job, helping the men to build a roof over part of the castle. They were coupled up to some flatbeds, which held a tall platform that was being used to raise the roof beams. The engines would have to move it to the right place for each beam. They had never had a job like this before. They would all have to work together. Gordon was pulling the express when Spencer came up alongside him. Spencer tried to pull ahead, but Gordon kept pace with him as they raced along. Then there was trouble. There was something on the track ahead of Gordon. It was Stephen! There was nothing Gordon could do. He had to go slowly. Back at the castle, Thomas and his friends were working together again. Then there was trouble. Luckily, no one was hurt. Paxton and Diesel were very surprised to see Stephen turn up at Brendam Docks. Poor Stephen felt disappointed, but if his new job wasn't at Brendam Docks, he just had to continue on his quest to find it. After the accident was cleared away, Thomas and his friends worked hard to complete the roof. At last, the final beam was put into place. The job was done. Stephen was heading up to the Blue Mountain Quarry. But the Blue Mountain Quarry was much bigger and noisier than any quarry Stephen had ever seen before. Stephen was coupled to a long line of trucks loaded with slate. But they were too heavy. The men uncoupled one of the trucks, and Stephen tried again. And again. And again. Until Stephen finally managed to pull one truck forward. But it was too late. As Stephen came to the bend, the heavy truck pushed him forward and nearly ran him off the rails. Stephen's quest to find his new job was not over yet. Back at the Earl's estate, Thomas, James, and Percy were amazed to see what was inside the Earl's crates. There were thrones and catapults, flags and tapestries, old statues, shields, and suits of armor from all over the world. Hero was very happy to be coming back to Sodor from the mainland. When? James was very happy to be having a washdown. When? Gordon and Spencer were very happy to be racing each other again. When? The two speedy engines were waiting at a red signal. They were both streamlined like Spencer. Stephen was on the slope below the castle when he noticed the track to the old mine. Stephen made his way along the overgrown track. But when he finally reached the entrance to the mine, he found it was boarded up. Thomas and Percy were ready to push the troublesome trucks loaded with dirt away. The Earl thought they were too heavy for two small engines alone. But Thomas didn't want to wait for James to come back. He wanted to tell Stephen all about his new job. But it was too late. The troublesome trucks were already on the slope. They started to pull forward, dragging Thomas and Percy behind them. The troublesome trucks were too heavy to stop. There was only one way to go. Thomas and Percy pulled the heavy trucks back again, feeling very relieved. They didn't realize that poor Stephen was now trapped in the mine. The island of Sodor was buzzing with excitement about the grand opening of Ulfstead Castle. Visitors were hurrying across from the mainland to be there. All the engines were working hard to make sure everything was ready. Thomas went to the steamworks to find Stephen. Thomas was worried about Stephen, and when he told James and Percy, they were worried too. So Thomas, James, and Percy set off to find Stephen. They asked everyone they met if they had seen him. Nobody knew where Stephen was, and it was starting to get dark. Stephen raced around the old mine, but he couldn't find another way out. Then, as he hurried round a bend, he bashed into some rocks. It started a rock slide. Back at Tidman's sheds, Thomas told the other engines that Stephen was missing. As the dust cleared, Stephen saw an old wooden chest amongst the fallen rocks. The next morning, Thomas woke all the engines up early. He had only one thing on his mind. They searched every shunting yard station, and tunnel. There was no sign of Stephen anywhere. Poor Stephen was running out of steam. Wheel turn by wheel turn, he tried to keep going, but Thomas pushed his way along the overgrown track. The last section of track was weak, where the wooden supports had rotted away. Then, Thomas came to the end of the line, where the entrance to the mine was blocked by the stones. He was about to leave again, when he noticed something down below the track. Stephen tried to whistle, but nothing came out. His boiler was almost dry. Stephen tried to whistle again. He summoned all his energy and... As quick as his pistons could pump, Thomas hurried to Ulfstead Castle to fetch help. Then he raced back to the old mine with Jack. But Stephen didn't answer. As soon as the entrance was cleared, Thomas rushed forward. The weak track shifted under his weight, but Thomas moved bravely over it and into the mine. By this time, the news of Stephen's rescue had spread. The next day was the opening of Ulfstead Castle. Guests came from all over the island, and the mainland as well.